by public referendum. I'm now going to call upon Councilman Bill de Blasio.
Thank you very much. Thank you, David, and I want to thank Chair Weprin for his leadership in introducing this legislation. I think it represents the feelings of many, many New Yorkers and many people in public life as well. You know, we have to look at the larger impact of our actions in public life. I think there's a question here of what we're doing on this issue and how it affects the public's belief in the democratic process and how it affects their faith in their elected officials. And I think these are really the bigger issues here. The democratic process is predicated on consistency. We saw, and I think so dramatically, after 9/11, arguably the greatest crisis in the history of our city, when Mayor Giuliani offered the notion of staying on just 3 more months. And even in that moment of crisis, the people were not comfortable with any change in our elections and in their schedule, because there's something about the predictability and the consistency that speaks to the strength of our democratic process. On the question of faith, unfortunately, every day it seems the public is given a reason to doubt the quality and the integrity of their elected officials locally or nationally. Well, we can't keep giving them reasons. We have to, in fact, go the other way and show the public that there's real integrity and commitment amongst elected officials. And the notion of elected officials giving themselves a term limit extension this late in the game obviously undermines public faith. You know, when you talk to folks about it, you hear immediately that torrent of feeling that so many elected officials are just in it for themselves, and that's corrosive to our process. That has to end. So we have to say very clearly, we're here in the 11th hour. There is an election, a primary election for citywide, borough-wide, local office a year from tomorrow. It's that soon. And we cannot change the game in the 11th hour or in the 9th inning, whatever you prefer. And the bottom line is the only way to entertain this question, whether you believe in extending term limits or you don't believe in it, the only way structurally, the only appropriate way democratically to entertain this notion is through an additional referendum. It cannot be done by legislation. I would vote no if any such legislation came before the council, and I'm glad that Chair Weprin has taken the action of putting in the right kind of legislation to say this must be done by referendum. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman de Blasio. Councilman Eric Gioia.
Thank you, Chairman Weprin. My name is Eric Gioia, G-I-O-I-A. There is a lack of trust in government. And when you open up the newspaper every day, there's no wonder why there's a lack of trust in government. Whether it be politicians getting arrested, abusing the privileges of their office, or trying to unilaterally change the terms of their employment. People rightly ask questions on whose side these politicians are on. And I think there's a legitimate question, what's better, 12 years or 8 years? I think that's a legitimate question. 12 years may turn out to be better than 8 years. But it's a question in a debate that should happen publicly. Imagine if you could walk into your boss and unilaterally change the terms of your employment. How much money you're making, how long you get to keep the job, how many days off you get a year, different perks you get. We work for the people, not the other way around. And I think it's important that we do everything we can, not only to get the number of years right, but to rebuild people's faith in what we do. You know, philosophically, I'd always been opposed to term limits. The idea that people were the limit, and that they throw the folks out when they didn't want them there was the idea. But we wouldn't be here without term limits in all likelihood. David, myself, or Bill. And what I've seen is that term limits are a very good thing for New York. It brings a different vision, it brings a new vision, a new vigor, and I like the idea of bringing a sense of urgency to government. And so, that being said, I think a strong argument can be made that 12 years is better than 8, but the appropriate place to have that argument is publicly with a referendum.
Thank you, Councilman Gioia. Susan Lerner, Executive Director of Common Cause.
Thank you, Councilman, and thank you, Council members. We're very pleased to see this discussion going on. We want to thank the Mayor, we want to thank Councilman Weber, who are really bringing the issue and the whole issue to the fore, highlighting what we are talking about. We need to have a more thorough examination of how term limits work here in New York City. While they're unique in New York State, they're not unique throughout the country. We now have in some places as much as a decade of experience with how term limits work for legislative bodies like the City Council, how they work in the city setting. And we should be having a discussion. As Councilmember Joya said, is 8 years the right amount? Should term limits be staggered? There are a lot of issues which we as students of government and as the bosses for elected officials should be talking about. How do we get the maximum benefit? How do we have an effective city government? Does term limits help? Could term limits be improved? That's not the discussion we're having. The discussion we're having is, should it be pushed through unilaterally by the City Council? That's the wrong question. We very strongly support Councilmember Weber's attempt to be sure that this issue is one which is squarely in the hands of the City Council and the city elected officials, employers, the people. It should be a referendum. We should be having a discussion in depth throughout the city of these important questions of how to ensure that term limits are correctly calibrated for New York City. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. I'm about to introduce Ken Moldner, who's the spokesperson for New Yorkers for Term Limits. And I have to tell you, Ken and I disagree on the position of term limits. There was a public referendum that was put on the ballot, and New Yorkers for Term Limits felt strongly about limiting terms. I, on the other hand, felt that the voters should decide, and it should be up to the public whether to keep their people in office or not, and they should decide on term limits, and that's obviously what we have is elections. However, since so much has gone into these two referendums, and the people have spoken time in and time again, and I've been approached by more constituents on this issue than almost any other issue I've faced in my 7 years in the City Council, where they have told me that it would be totally wrong for the City Council and really self-serving to take a vote now in the 11th hour and to overturn the will of the people, which was done by public referendum. So that's why I introduced the bill. That's why I feel strongly that the City Council should not change the term limits law, but it should be changed by public referendum. Ken Moldner from New Yorkers for Term Limits.
Thank you, Council Member. The reason we're here today is to express our support for this important legislation. It's all about respect for the will of the people, and that's what this legislation does. And frankly, we think that it ought to be self-evident that when in a democracy the people vote for something, you may agree with it, you may disagree with it, that's fine, but then let them vote on it again. And that's why we're here, to support this legislation, because it's about respect for the people. That's what the legislation does.
Thank you, Ken. I'd be happy to answer any questions.